in which my son is proud of what we do in a world and a job that actually does impact people's lives for the better.
In this video, we are going to take you inside one of the most heart-stopping, soul-shaking moments the British royal family has ever faced. A moment that brought the entire world to its knees, that silenced cities, that made strangers light candles on rain-soaked streets, and that forced a family built on centuries of composure to finally let their masks fall. This is the story of a night that changed the monarchy forever. A night when the future of the crown hung by the thinnest thread imaginable, and the love of one woman refused to let it break. Stay with us until the very end, because what unfolded in those hours is something history will never forget. It began without warning. No signs, no preparation, just an ordinary evening that turned into every royal family's worst nightmare in a matter of seconds. At precisely 6:47 in the evening, a royal helicopter carrying Prince William disappeared from radar over the Lake District. One moment, it was a steady green signal blinking across the screen. The next moment, silence. Gone. The pilot's last transmission was barely audible, swallowed by static and the low growl of a gathering storm. Witnesses on the ground later described the sky splitting open with light and noise, and some claimed they saw something streak downward through the clouds before the valley went completely quiet. That silence was not peace. That silence was the sound of history holding its breath. Inside Windsor Castle, the evening had been proceeding with its usual quiet dignity. Dinner was being prepared. Staff moved through their routines, and then the phones began to ring. First one, then another, then all of them at once. Aides stood frozen, their faces draining of color as the news passed from one to another in hushed, horrified tones. Within minutes, the entire corridor had transformed. The gentle hum of palace protocol shattered completely, replaced by urgent footsteps and barely controlled panic. And then came the moment that no aide ever wants to face. A single staff member walked to where King Charles sat and leaned in close. "Your Majesty, we have lost contact with the prince." The king turned white. Those who were present said they watched a man who had carried the weight of a nation simply crumble from the inside. He gripped the edge of the table as though the floor itself had tilted beneath him. His lips trembled before the words finally came, broken and barely audible. "Not my son. Not again." In that single sentence, the grief of a lifetime poured through the cracks, because Charles had already buried too much, and now the nightmare had returned, wearing a different face. Emergency response teams launched into action immediately. Rescue crews battled through torrential rain and fierce winds, their torches cutting thin lines of light through the darkness over the hills of Cumbria. They moved through mud and debris, shouting into the storm, searching through the wreckage of twisted metal that had been scattered across a remote hillside. The scene was devastating. Every piece of debris they uncovered told the story of an impact so violent, so sudden, that survival itself seemed impossible. And yet they searched, because when it comes to a future king, you search until you cannot search anymore. Back at Windsor, Catherine received the news in the worst possible way. There is no gentle version of those words, no careful framing that softens the blow when someone tells a wife that her husband's helicopter has gone down. She screamed, not a polished royal kind of distress. A real, raw, human scream that echoed off the marble walls and froze every person who heard it. The sound of her crying carried down the hallways, and staff who had served the palace for decades later said they had never heard anything like it. One aide dropped her phone to the floor and could only stand there, whispering a prayer through trembling lips. Because this was not a political crisis. This was not a matter of protocol or press management. This was a wife who did not know if her husband was still alive. A mother who did not know if her children would have their father by morning. The convoy that carried Catherine to the hospital moved through the rain-soaked streets of London at speed, blue and white lights flashing against the wet road. Inside the vehicle she sat completely still, hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed somewhere far away, her lips moving slightly as she whispered his name over and over like a quiet, desperate prayer. Every traffic light felt like an eternity. Every corner they turned felt heavier than the last. When the convoy finally pulled up to the hospital, cameras were already there, lenses pressed through the rain. Catherine stepped out, drenched, grief written across every feature of her face. For one brief moment, the world watching on their screens did not see a princess. They saw a woman standing at the edge of the worst moment of her life, walking forward because there was nothing else left to do. Inside the emergency ward, the world of royal protocol ceased to exist entirely. Doctors moved with rapid, focused precision. Nurses called codes across the room. The air was thick with antiseptic and urgency. And at the center of it all, connected to machines that were doing the work his body could not yet manage on its own, was Prince William. Tubes, wires, the relentless steady beeping of monitors measuring out each second of his survival. Catherine crossed the room and sank to her knees beside the bed. She took his hand in both of hers and pressed her forehead against it, her tears falling silently onto his skin. "Stay with me," she whispered. That was all she could say. "Stay with me." King Charles stood at the foot of the bed, completely silent, holding a rosary that had once belonged to his mother, his fingers working the beads slowly, methodically, as though the rhythm of it was the only thing keeping him standing. For the first time perhaps in his entire reign, the crown felt utterly powerless. It could not negotiate with this. It could not manage this with a press statement or a public appearance. All it could do was stand in a hospital room and hope. The hours that followed were the longest of their lives. The storm outside did not ease. Thunder rolled in waves, and for those sitting in that hospital room, it felt as though the sky itself was mimicking the rhythm of the monitors. Each rumble of thunder another second counted out. Catherine did not leave his side. She did not sleep, she did not eat, she only watched, her eyes moving between his face and the screens, reading every fluctuation like a language she was only just learning. At 2 in the morning, a nurse noted quietly that she had not moved from that chair in 6 hours. No one suggested she should, because everyone in that room understood that she was holding him there by the sheer force of her presence, that her staying was not symbolic, it was necessary. While the vigil continued inside, the world outside was transforming in ways no one had anticipated. At dawn, Buckingham Palace released a single sentence. "The Prince of Wales remains in critical condition following a helicopter incident in Cumbria." No context, no explanation, just those words, and they were enough to stop the world. In London, people on their way to work simply stopped walking. In cafes, conversations died mid-sentence as televisions replayed the same footage on loop. In front of Buckingham Palace, the flowers began to arrive almost immediately. People carried them through the rain and set them down in silence. Candles were lit in the wet morning air, their flames guttering but refusing to go out. Reporters standing outside the palace gates spoke in voices barely above whispers, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. Across the world, the response was immediate and overwhelming. World leaders sent messages. Social media became a single, unbroken stream of prayers and candle emojis and 3 words repeated endlessly. "We are praying." For a country that still carried the unhealed wound of losing Diana, this felt unbearably familiar. Like a nightmare it had already lived through once, returning without mercy. But even as the public vigil unfolded in the streets, something else was happening behind the closed doors of the palace. Something that would take the tragedy and twist it into something far more unsettling. It began with a single line buried inside a security report. "The flight data shows irregularities." Princess Anne was the first to demand that those words be explained clearly. "Mechanical failures," she said firmly during a private briefing, "do not cause a helicopter to vanish from radar without warning." Something else happened in that sky. The military's preliminary analysis came back and confirmed what the family had quietly feared. The helicopter's systems had been interfered with externally. Someone had reached into the technology that was supposed to keep that aircraft safe and had deliberately broken it. King Charles stared at the report for a long time without speaking. When he finally closed the folder, he said only 4 words. "Keep this contained. For now." Across the Atlantic, in California, Prince Harry received the call in the early hours of the morning. The same words that had destroyed his childhood once before now reached him again through a phone pressed against his ear in a darkened room. "There's been an accident." He went completely still. Then he turned to Meghan and said quietly, "It is happening again." Within hours, he was moving. Not toward cameras, not toward statements, just toward his brother. The way brothers do when the world stops making sense. Back inside the palace, unity was fracturing under the pressure. Some members of the family demanded full transparency. The public deserved the truth. Britain deserved to know that this had not been an accident. Charles held firm on silence, arguing that releasing unconfirmed findings could trigger panic, could compromise the investigation, could do damage that no amount of truth would repair. Catherine, still seated beside William's bed with dark circles beneath her eyes and her voice worn down to almost nothing, said only one thing when she was asked her view. "Whatever truth there is," she said quietly, "do not bury it with him." The chapel inside the palace stayed lit through those nights. Camilla sat alone in the pews for long stretches, lighting candles one by one, filling the silence with prayers that she did not share with anyone. The monarchy, which had always presented itself as an institution above the chaos of ordinary human emotion, was bleeding from the inside. Every conversation ended in raised voices, every decision ended in doubt. The walls of that palace held centuries of secrets, and now they were being asked to hold one more. And then, in the grey quiet of an early morning, something shifted. A nurse standing beside William's bed looked down and saw it. A faint movement. The smallest possible signal from a body that had been fighting in silence. She gasped. Catherine was on her feet before the sound had fully formed. The doctors came quickly. Monitors were checked. And then, cautiously, someone said the word that the room had been waiting 3 days to hear. "He is responding." Catherine pressed her forehead against his hand and shook with silent, overwhelming relief. "You are still here," she whispered. "You are still mine." Outside, morning was breaking over London, and the world did not yet know. But inside that room, the miracle had already begun. The hospital released its updated statement at sunrise. The Prince of Wales has shown small but promising signs of improvement. The effect was instantaneous. People standing outside Buckingham Palace, who had spent the night in the rain with their candles and their flowers, broke into quiet applause. A little girl holding a handmade sign looked up at her mother and whispered, "He is waking up." Across the country, people exhaled for the first time in days. The clouds above London seemed to thin slightly, and pale sunlight pushed through in long golden strips, and everyone who saw it felt as though the sky was responding to the news. The investigation, meanwhile, was reaching its conclusion in a room that very few people would ever know existed. The final classified report was presented to only 4 people: King Charles, Princess Anne, Camilla, and the chief investigator. What that report contained was the kind of information that changes the way power understands itself. The helicopter's navigation frequency had been deliberately compromised. An external signal had overridden the aircraft's system mid-flight, sending it off course with surgical precision. This was not a malfunction. It was not weather. It was not human error. It was targeted, calculated interference. The investigator laid it out plainly. "This was not an accident, Your Majesty. It was a message." Anne's hands clenched into fists. "A message from whom?" she asked. The silence that followed was its own answer. Because even the investigators did not yet know who. They only knew that someone, somewhere, had decided that the future King of England needed to be reminded of his vulnerability. Charles looked at the papers in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked up. "The crown survives," he said quietly, "but it bleeds." Down the hallway, at that exact moment, William's eyes opened. Not the faint flutter of reflexes from days before. His eyes opened. They moved slowly across the ceiling, then turned toward the woman sitting beside him. Catherine's breath stopped completely. She watched his gaze find her face, watched the recognition move through his eyes like light returning to a room that had been dark for too long. She smiled through tears that she did not try to hold back. "You are not home yet," she whispered, "but you will be soon." A single tear moved down his cheek. And in that small, quiet, entirely private moment between a husband and wife, something enormous was restored. The news broke within the hour. He woke up. 3 words. The entire world responded as though a dam had broken. Church bells rang across London without any coordination, as if the towers themselves had decided all at once that silence was no longer appropriate. In Times Square, screens carried the headline. In Sydney, people gathered in the early morning light. In Kenya, a choir sang. And in a quiet corridor of a London hospital, Harry walked toward his brother's room with no cameras, no security detail visible, and no prepared statement. He entered, saw William lying there, and placed his hand on his shoulder. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Because some things between brothers exist in a language older than speech, and forgiveness is one of them. Weeks passed. William's recovery was gradual, then steady, then remarkable. Catherine never left his side for long. She slept in a chair beside his bed for the first week. She read to him. She held his hand through the difficult nights. She was not performing devotion. She simply loved him. And that love was the most honest thing anyone in that palace had shown the world in a very long time. When he was finally strong enough, Catherine wheeled him through the hospital doors into the sunlight, and the crowd waiting outside erupted with a sound that shook the air. She smiled for the cameras the way she always does, with grace and quiet dignity. But her eyes carried everything that the smile was too small to hold. Every sleepless night, every prayer whispered into the dark, every moment she had sat in that chair and refused to believe the worst. She looked at the crowd and said simply, "The crown has endured many storms. This one reminded us why. Because we faced them together." Inside the palace chapel later that same evening, the royal family gathered with no titles and no formality. Just people who had been pushed to the edge of loss and had somehow held on to each other. Harry embraced his father for the first time in years, and Charles held him and whispered, "I thought I had lost both my sons at once. I will not make that mistake again." Whatever had divided them, whatever years of distance and hurt and misunderstanding had built up between them, the weight of nearly losing William had dissolved it. Not completely, not permanently perhaps, but in that moment it was gone. And that was enough. William stood on the balcony for the first time since the crash on a bright afternoon that the crowds below had gathered for in their thousands. He looked thinner. He moved carefully, but he stood. Catherine was beside him, her hand in his. Charles stood slightly behind them, looking out over the sea of upturned faces with tears that he did not entirely manage to conceal. 3 generations of the monarchy, standing together beneath the flag, not as symbols of an institution, but as human beings who had been broken and had chosen to rebuild. The crowd below sang. The sound rose up like something physical, warm and golden, wrapping around the balcony and the people standing on it. And in that moment, Britain found something it had not realized it had lost. Not just hope for the heir to the throne, hope for itself. Because what this story ultimately revealed was something that no crown, no title, no amount of ceremony had ever been able to communicate as clearly. The monarchy is not an idea. It is not a tradition. It is not a set of protocols dressed in historical clothing. It is people. People who love each other badly and imperfectly. People who make mistakes and carry grief and fight through fear. People who sit beside a hospital bed in the middle of the night and whisper, "Stay with me," and mean it with everything they have. William's survival became something larger than one man's recovery. It became a mirror held up to every person who has ever sat in a waiting room and bargained with God. Every person who has ever watched someone they love fight for their life and found that love was the only weapon they had. Every person who has ever lost everything and then, against all odds, been handed back the thing they could not live without. Miracles, it turns out, do not live in palaces. They live in people who simply refuse to give up. If this video moved you in any way, please take a moment right now to hit the like button and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that resilience is real, that love holds, and that even the darkest nights eventually give way to morning. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you are always the first to know when we bring you the next chapter from inside the world's most watched royal family. We are here every week with stories that go deeper than the headlines, stories that remind us what it really means to endure, to love, and to keep going when the world is watching and waiting for you to fall. And before you go, we want to hear from you directly, because your voice matters in this community. Here is our question for you today, and we want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe that a family can only truly find its way back to each other after it has been brought to the very edge of losing everything? Have you ever experienced a moment in your own life where crisis became the unexpected doorway back to the people you love most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because thousands of people are reading those comments, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. We will see you in the next one.